Good morning. It's June 9th, 2022. Welcome to Triggered. I'm Cory Morgan. This is the Western Standard's daily live show, news, events, and of course, interviews. We have a lot of great guests coming all the time. Today's a really packed one. I've got 3 guests on. I usually go with 2, but we've gone with 3, and there will be lots to discuss of interest. To start with, though, let's start on some of the lighter stuff. What's going on today? What does June 9th represent? How does it stand out? You don't want to forget those observances, those daily things that are so important. Well, it's Donald Duck Day. I know you all already knew that, but just for those few folks who might have forgotten it, today is Donald Duck Day, and you wouldn't want to be the odd one out at lunchtime going out and not having your proper Donald Duck observance attire or whatever is done to celebrate Donald Duck Day. It's also National Strawberry Rhubarb Pie Day. This is the time to get at it, cut that stuff up before it gets too long and tough, and boil it down. That's a good North American dish, a common one. So yes, be sure to celebrate your national strawberry rhubarb pies if you're into that. I find them really sweet though. Got to cut those down with a bit of stuff. Okay, guests-wise, getting into some of the more serious things in political discourse and debate and all that stuff we do around here. We got Benjamin Woodfinden. He's a doctoral student, a young fella, and political and constitutional theorist. And he's written stuff, he's done stuff online. And he wrote a really good column on populism and how it's been labeled. And it's not particularly the type of populism we have going on right now isn't actually as crazy or extreme or pursuing as much change as it can. But it's being used as a term against Pierre Poilievre's campaign, for example. So it'll be a good discussion just on those definitions. What is populism? Is it bad? Is it good? I think it can be both. It depends on what they're doing. After that, I'm going to have George Porter on. Now, he's a veteran Alberta paramedic. He's been lobbying for years and years on fixing Alberta's emergency services system. I mean, we've got some serious problems. Ambulances are being drawn away from rural areas. Red alerts are happening all the time when there's no ambulances available in urban areas and rural areas, and people are getting hurt. So, there's a lot of discourse going on last weekend's incident with the dogs. I don't know if Mr. Porter's going to go so much into that because it's recent and there's still facts coming out, but it's brought the issue to a head and, it's worth discussing further. So since people are looking at the ambulance service, let's talk about the real problems going on. And then right at the end, I'm going to have Dr. Leslyn Lewis on, just a quick 10-minute shot. And it was her press release that caught my eye on the World Economic Forum kind of travel program, this idea of a digital ID, things that would be shared by Canadians, by the Canadian government on your behalf, with the World Economic Forum or with international type of organizations. And of course, she is in opposition to that. So it'll be good to talk to Dr. Lewis and see where she's going with that, because nobody else is really talking about it on the federal leadership front. So yes, comments. I can see people coming in from all over Chauvin. Yes, that land of that big softball. What's that, straight down from Provost there? Folks out in BC, all over the place again. I love seeing you checking in, guys. Lets me know you're out there and that we're reaching people. So just keep the comments civil, but by all means, use that comment scroll and discuss with each other. Throw questions my way, throw questions towards the guests. All right, let's get on to what's got me going today. Speaking of populism, well, the opposite of populism is elitism, powered by authoritarianism. Now, climate change extremists are being indulged by authoritarian governments to try and force people out of their vehicles. And while they're failing terribly at getting people out of their cars, they're causing stress and economic damage with their efforts. They can't create appeal for their plans with the majority of citizens, so they're counting on top-down government efforts to further their agenda. And they're getting that effort, getting that help. Despite over a decade of effort on the part of governments to push us into electric vehicles, for example, 95% of drivers still won't use them. Electric cars remain an expensive luxury for urban-dwelling virtue signalers. We've spent billions trying to force people to embrace electrical vehicles, and it's failed. Governments are responding, though, by spending billions more and continuing to punish people who choose to drive personal internal combustion vehicles. Now, in municipalities across North America, expensive and essential roadway access has been taken away from cars and given over to segregated bicycle lanes. This has only increased traffic congestion in urban centers, and the number of dedicated bicycle commuters has remained as low as it ever was. Come on, there's only so many spandex aficionados who are really going to go to all that trouble to ride all the way into work and back every day. There's always been a small core of them. It doesn't get any bigger. City planners have felt that if they could just make traffic bad enough and make parking expensive enough, commuters would just toss away their car keys and choose to ride bicycles to work. Never mind that our streets are covered in snow and ice for half the year. Ideological city planners backed by climate-obsessed city mayors and councillors are zoning and creating apartment buildings with no parking provided. Unsurprisingly, such developments have to be heavily subsidized because nobody actually wants to live in them. Even if one doesn't have a vehicle themselves, do they want to force every visitor to their homes to park miles away and take transit or taxis to come on by and have a beer? Living without practical parking in urban areas is just not desirable. Now, pedestrian zones created in downtown areas have killed some ground-level retail businesses. In Calgary, the once bustling Stephen Avenue Mall, which was a pedestrian zone, sure, but it's turned into an economic dead zone, where for-lease signs grace most of the storefronts, and homeless people, rather than shoppers, predominantly prowl the strip. I mean, while the mall had been popular at one time, it's because parking nearby was plentiful, accessible, and affordable. Now, due to traffic snarls and a lack of available parking, people have taken their business to the suburbs, and the place has dried up. But what about transit, though? Well, in many cities, transit's been overrun with addicts, creating disorder and mayhem. In Calgary, thanks to the honor system for fare payment, coupled with a woke city council who refused to crack down on what they call vulnerable people, the transit system has turned into a dystopian nightmare. Violent incidents on trains are commonplace, while discarded syringes and human waste decorate bus shelters and train stations. City Council in Calgary actually closed a number of train stations due to the encampments of violent addicts in them, rather than dealing with the issue. Ridership on Calgary Transit's at 64% of what it was only 2 years ago, and it continues to decline. Even with gas nearing $2 a liter, people won't choose to subject themselves to the dangerous nightmare of riding on city trains. Now, Calgary has had its city council dominated with anti-auto zealots since Naheed Nenshi was elected as mayor over a decade ago. The result of 10 years of anti-car policies hasn't taken anybody out of their cars, but it's led to a dysfunctional and dangerous downtown, at least contributed towards it, with over 30% commercial vacancy rates. They've tried to blame this in the past on the oil crash, but that doesn't cut it. New businesses are setting up in Alberta all the time. They just keep building their facilities outside of the city limits. Nobody wants to move a business into a city center with congested traffic, expensive parking, and high crime. It makes it rather hard to draw employees into work for you. And there's no intention that city planners are learning from this or giving up. The city right now plans to close a busy street that offers one of the few crossings for a major rail line leaving downtown to build an underpass exclusively for pedestrians and bicycles. All this is going to do is cause even more traffic havoc and perhaps create a new location for a tent city. Again, these planners and their supporters live in a delusional world where they feel if they can just piss drivers off enough, those drivers will just throw up their hands and stop driving. But it isn't working. Climate zealots just can't seem to realize they need to create a realistic alternative to cars before people are going to stop using them. Electric cars are still too expensive and impractical for most people. Bicycles are a novelty and a hobby for most. Transit is not nearly safe or good enough for people to rely on. If the anti-car crowd would address building an alternative to cars first, they'd have a great deal more success in convincing people to give up on them. Do they really think that a parent of 4 kids is going to ride a bus and haul groceries for a family that size 4 times a week? Do they think a person in their 60s is going to ride a bicycle an hour to work every day in January? Do they think a slight young woman is going to subject herself daily to the criminal mayhem on trains in order to get to work? Suburbs and satellite cities are booming while the inner city neighborhoods are declining. Urban planners and climate zealots have to stop trying to use the stick, and they got to find some carrots. The current strategy has been a total failure, and it's coming at a terrible cost for all of us. Quit punishing citizens for using the only practical, viable, and affordable form of transportation we have, and that is the personal automobile. All right, well, the war on cars carries on. Let's get to our newsroom and check in with Dave Naylor and see what else is going on out there. Hey, Dave, how's it going?
It's going well, Cory. Do you know why I'm wearing red today?
No, I don't. For the rhubarb, maybe?
Maybe, but it's more for the Stampeders kicking off their season tonight in CFL action. They're going to destroy the hapless Montreal team. It's good. It's a good day when CFL kicks off, and another opportunity to mock our friends in Edmonton, home of the Edmonton Elks. And it's not even grammarly correct, Cory. How can you have a team that's not even grammarly correct?
Well, that's true, and that's where the Battle of Alberta can pick up, and at least Calgary can retain some pride and knock down those nasty Edmontonians in the football field, at least, if not in the hockey arenas.
Yeah, if Bo Levi stays healthy, it's going to be a good year, I think. Got some interesting stuff on this site, Cory. The feds, in their infinite wisdom, have decided they're going to look at putting Health Canada warnings on the front of ground beef labels in Canada. Because it's it's got some saturated fats and other bad things in there for you. Obviously, the Canadian Cattlemen's Association has a bit more common sense, and they're not too happy with it. So their comments are in the story. We've got Theresa Tam batten down the hatches again. She says the 7th wave of COVID is on the way, and it will hit just after Labor Day. So she's telling Canadians to get prepared. So. Deep sigh on that one. Pierre Poilievre has released a statement this morning calling on the federal public safety minister, Marco Mendicino, to resign. He's being caught as Canada's liar-in-chief over the Freedom Convoy events. He repeatedly said police had asked the government to bring in the Emergencies Act, and police force after police force have said, no, they didn't. So Poilievre wants him out. Quite rightly. The CTF has done a access to information release on the board of directors meetings for the Bank of Canada in 2019. $140,000 for the 9 board of directors to have 5 meetings. High cost because they stayed in some of Canada's most luxurious hotels, in the most luxurious suites. So $140,000 they rang up in 5 meetings. Premier Kenny was on hand this morning at a big announcement at the UFC. The government's chipping in $23 million to build some a quantum hub technology that is way too over my head for me to try and explain. But our reporter there, Mel Risden, did get some FaceTime with the health minister, Jason Copping, and has questioned him about the horrible tragedy this week of the elderly woman being mauled to death by the 3 pit bull type dogs, and what the Alberta Health Services are doing about it to try and make sure that there's not another 30-minute wait like she had to suffer through that time. So that's what we've got on the go this morning, Cory. Lots to come this afternoon, and go Stamps go tonight.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to go out of my way to eat a large steak just in defiance of Health Canada and their latest way of trying to tell me what I'm allowed to eat.
It's utterly ridiculous.
Oh, man. All right. Thanks, Steve. I'll talk to you after the show.
See you, Cory.
So, yes, that was our news editor, Dave Naylor, running through all of those stories. As we see, there's lots breaking, lots already been written, and we have lots of reporters all across the country covering this stuff. As Dave mentioned, Mel Risden, yes, she was sent out in the field early this morning to try and get some quotes, and I think had a bit of a hard time at a Kenny presser. We'll see how that goes with things such as that. But Mel's always putting stuff out. Amanda, Eva's back, and then we've got Rachel. It's hard to start. Like you see, I used to be able to name the whole news crew quickly just to give them all a thumbs up, but we have over a dozen folks all across out there bringing this stuff to you, writing these stories and getting them out there. So again, this is where I like to remind everybody the reason we can do that, the reason we're covering this, the reason we're giving you an alternative from the legacy media, the tax bailed out media, is because of you guys who have been subscribing. So again, thank you all to those who have subscribed already. And if you haven't yet, get on there, check it out, westernstandard.news/membership. For $10 a month, or even less if you go with an annual plan at $99 a year, you get full unfettered access to all of our columns, our news stories, breaking stories, all of those things on the website. It's well worth it. Again, we never thought twice about paying for a newspaper subscription back in the past, which would cost you more than this, and you'd have a whole bunch of newspaper to have to get rid of afterwards. We're not asking for charity. We're just asking to provide for you to pay for us to provide a service so that we can keep expanding and doing as we have been. So again, take out a subscription. That's how we can support independent media, and we can keep going and keep expanding. Look at all those names. That's just the news department there. Plus, we have a whole pile of freelancers and other folks who are contributing things and columnists, and that is thanks to you. And I should move on, I guess, and talk about the other aspect and support our sponsors and advertisers. Again, like newspaper subscriptions, you paid to get it to your door, but also you would get some advertising in there. That's how we can pay our bills. It's capitalism. It's great. And in our case, we have advertisers, one of which is Bitcoin Well. And those guys have been a great sponsor for us for quite some time. They're a Western Canadian company, which, how can I not like that? It's a bricks and mortar thing. It's not some digital business way overseas or something like that. This is a publicly traded company with ATMs all across Canada. If you're looking to get into digital currencies, get involved with that, this is the way to go. This is the way to keep your money safe. To sit down, you can have one-on-one, in-person consultations with these guys to see if maybe Bitcoin's not for you, maybe it is. The bottom line is you need to learn about it. And these guys are a trustworthy source to do so. And you always hang on to your money. If you're going to get involved in it, it's non-custodial. It's always in your wallet. They're just helping you along with the process. So check them out, bitcoinwell.com, and take control of your money. Okay, let's see. Before we get on to our guest, maybe we'll go on some news stuff. Yeah, so something Dave was talking about, and we'll talk more with my guest a little later. With AHS, boy, the finger-pointing game is going all over on that awful incident for people from other regions who might not have been familiar with it. A few days ago, an 86-year-old woman was attacked in her garden by 3 pit bull-type dogs. She was terribly mauled. And she passed away. She passed away before she even got to the hospital. And it was found that the ambulance had taken over half an hour to get to her. So now all the fingers are pointing in all sorts of directions. Whose fault is this? And one of the worst that I've seen, and we've seen the pleas from the woman who called 911, the neighbor who went outside and saw her elderly neighbor having been mauled terribly by 3 dogs. She called 911. And it sounds like it turned into a gong show, but AHS is sort of blaming her. They're sort of making it sound like the caller wasn't clear on what happened. And she's pretty upset. It's unfortunate after a tragedy, we get a bunch of finger pointing rather than Alberta Health Services maybe just saying, hey, something went wrong, let's fix it. But no, they're trying to blame the caller. And it's bizarre. It sounds like Bylaw Services was the first one who showed up. So yes, the woman called in a dog attack, then you do want to call Bylaw Services. But when she called in, she also said they attacked an 86-year-old woman who's bleeding to death in her backyard. I mean, the AHS is claiming we didn't realize it was a life-threatening situation. Come on. And they're claiming the caller didn't make that clear. I don't know. You see, they won't release the transcript. How clear was it? But even then, even once the bylaw officer got there, the bylaw officer was trying to at least bypass what sounds like some incompetent or messed up 911 systems and get directly to an ambulance to bring him over. And as I brought up earlier in the show, Foothills Hospital, the biggest hospital in Alberta, was only 4 kilometers away. It was in an ambulance, probably an 8-minute drive most. And there's always ambulances sitting around the hospital because they're doing hallway care. And I'm going to talk to my later guest about that, the paramedic I have coming on. But instead, this bylaw officer is desperately calling while this poor woman is dying in her backyard to get that. Instead, he managed to get fire trucks to arrive. So fire trucks arrived and tried to stabilize the woman. And the fire trucks managed to get through and get to an ambulance and get an ambulance out there. By then, it was way too late. It had been 35 minutes. This poor woman passed away. And as I'd heard from another paramedic, staying anonymous, but he said, word is they definitely could have saved her if somebody had intervened in time. I mean, this was a case of trauma and bleeding. And Brenda, pit bull type. Yes, because it was pit bull types. They were Staffordshire Terriers. And I'm going to get more on that. That's a separate discussion altogether. Fair enough from a commenter. I'll state right off the bat, I don't like the idea of knee-jerk breed bans at all. I have a big problem with that. I think it's shallow. I think it's the same as the people who are saying we should ban all firearms because people misuse firearms elsewhere as well. But we do have to state things as they were. And all 3 of these dogs, one was an American pit bull, one was a Staffordshire Terrier, and another. So, I mean, pit bull type does cover the 3 of them. And it's not trying to demonize them. It is just saying what type of breed was involved in this, because it does open up an issue that we do need to discuss. And I will be discussing that a little more in the future. Either way, that's a story that's still unfolding as we get more facts, but it's pretty sad to see the big health bureaucracies and the emergency service and everybody pointing fingers at each other in a tragedy, trying to cover their butts, rather than having a more productive conversation saying, how can we make sure this doesn't happen again? Hopefully we can turn that conversation that way. As I said, I have a gentleman who spent decades as a paramedic in Alberta who will be coming on a little later, and we'll talk a bit about that. First, though, I'm going to bring in Ben Woodfinden. This will be the first time we've had Ben on the show. I read a great piece he'd written in the Hub talking about populism and how it's been applied with Pierre Poilievre's campaign, and pointing out that when we're talking about populism, it's really what they're talking about, or what Poilievre's proposing isn't that radical, though some are trying to frame it that way. So I was looking forward to this conversation. So, hey, Ben, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, good to be with you.
So I kind of framed it off to start a bit, you know, and you can see it in that title from your piece, you know, Canada's aspiring populists actually aren't all that radical. Maybe we'll just kind of start there. Where were you looking to go with that?
Yeah, well, you know, it was interesting to see some of the responses to the piece. I was kind of trying to make a broad kind of overarching point that we certainly have people in this country that you could describe as populists. And I don't use the word. I think some people use it as a pejorative, you know, as an insult. Some people use it as a praise. Honestly, I'm just trying to use it as kind of a descriptive word, right? I think certain people have that kind of populist streak, others don't. So the kind of broader point I was trying to make in the piece was that, you know, we do have these kind of populistic kind of figures, you know, right? Pierre Poilievre is obviously kind of the biggest name on the radar right now for a variety of reasons. But the bigger point I was trying to make was that these populists they might be populist, but they're not actually that radical in kind of some, you know, grand, significant way. They're not trying to kind of like, radically overturn kind of Canada's existing constitutional order. And then the more kind of maybe abstract point I was trying to make is that even our populists are kind of, they're broadly speaking kind of liberals in the real grand sense of the term, right? They're small L liberals and that they're committed to things like freedom and equality. They have different understandings of what that means from, say, kind of progressive or mainstream liberals do. But in some sense, there's differences there, but they're not quite as radical as our kind of certain kind of, I won't name names, but certain kind of legacy media, mainstream media voices want to suggest, right, that we have these real radical, dangerous populists in the midst. And I just don't think that's the case.
Yeah, well, and I mean, populism can be applied to a lot of movements or politicians historically that have risen and taken a public sentiment and perhaps, you know, inspired it a bit and brought it about and led to often big change. Sometimes it's been horrible. I mean, people could arguably say that the rise of Hitler was a populist movement in its time. But as you rightly pointed out in your column, so was the NDP. When they began, I mean, they were prairie populists coming from the left. So, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It depends on what the individual who is a populist plans to do.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just the NDP, right? The current Conservative Party, the CPC, also has roots in a kind of populist movement, right? The Reform Party, I think, I don't think, again, not an insult, I think it was fair to describe Reform as a kind of Western populist movement. And it's also interesting as well that Canada does have a long history of populist movements, right? I think it's fair to do like Reform, CCF, what becomes the NDP, I think are populist movements. I think even, going back a bit further, things like social credit were probably in some sense kind of populist movement. So if anything, the fact that we're seeing a bit of a bubbling of populism, especially in Western Canada again, if anything, that's not some aberration. That's in many ways kind of a return to the norm, right? The things that kind of really have driven Canadian politics for the last century and a half nearly. So yeah, in that sense, again, it's really nothing that radical. It's not that new.
No, and I mean we've had. Looking to Alberta, an example, you look a little young to perhaps remember, but with Ralph Klein, sort of, with an internal party rejuvenation movement almost. I mean, the Progressive Conservatives had been in power in Alberta for decades, but they've been getting stale. And he sort of roused up a populist sentiment within the province and rejuvenated his own party through that. And again, though, his changes really weren't all that terribly radical, though some would dispute that. He wasn't looking to tear down the system. He was just looking to get things back in order, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and again, I don't think it's one of my favorite kind of like you said, it's a bit before my time, but the kind of Great Reform, like the West wants in, right? Like that was a populist movement, but they were I think Reform was seeking in some sense kind of certain kind of significant changes back in the day. I mean, the most obvious kind of like institutional one was the changes to the Senate, the elected Senate, having an elected Senate. So that is in some sense a populist movement, right? It's an attempt to, and that is a kind of, I think it's probably fair to call something like that radical, and that it is attempting to change something. But again, radical doesn't necessarily mean good or bad, right? There could be bad radical changes, there could be good radical changes. And when we look at the kind of crop of populists we have today, and again, Poilievre is just kind of the creme de la creme of them right now, just given his kind of prominence he's got. Poilievre's tweaking at the edges on certain things. I think maybe some of the stuff he said about the Bank of Canada is probably his most kind of, it's called like institutionally challenging stuff. But again, if you go and you don't have to actually. This was a point I tried to make in the piece. You don't have to agree with what Poilievre is saying per se about the bank. Maybe you think he's completely wrong, but if you actually go and look at what he's saying about the bank, he's not suggesting that he wants to kind of destroy the Bank of Canada in the way that if you go and listen to some of the kind of like anti-neoliberal left-wing populists in places like Europe, they're quite often, these people will be quite anti-central banks, but what they're anti is very much the idea of kind of that like money and the supply of money should essentially belong to the people. That's not what Poilievre is offering, right? He's basically saying that he's arguing that the Bank of Canada's independence has been undermined by the mass spending and kind of essentially propping up a government agenda for 2 years. And what he wants to do is to essentially restore the independence. So again, you agree or disagree with Poilievre. I'll leave that up to the listener to decide. But what he's saying there is still not he's not actually radically trying to change the Bank of Canada. He thinks he's restoring it to what it historically should be, right? Which is an independent central bank that's job is to control inflation.
Well, that's it. And people dismiss him sometimes. And as you said, almost pejoratively, he's a populist, as if it's a bad thing in and of itself, when realistically we should be looking at the individual policies within it. I mean, if there's some that you think are too radical or too wrong, then bring out the policies. But to try and dismiss an entire campaign with that word, I think is a misappropriation of the word. And it's not allowing for a better conversation on what's going on.
Yeah. And again, I think a problem with so much Canadian discourse and politics kind of discussions more broadly is that we really do. I think we get lazy sometimes and we just look for analogy, like to make kind of lazy comparisons elsewhere, right? So I think about the people that Poilievre's been compared to, right? It's just every kind of populist under the sun, right? I've seen him compared to Trump, obviously, to Johnson in the UK, to Marine Le Pen in France, which I think is kind of a really kind of silly comparison. But again, if populism is a kind of Canadian, it's an old Canadian tradition, right? I actually think it's much more interesting to compare Poilievre to the older, maybe something like Preston Manning, right? Were there any similarities there? I think, and you're right. I don't think I wish people would use populist as kind of just a kind of descriptive label, right? I really think populism, might be described as kind of temperamental, right? There's a kind of populists certainly have a kind of tempestuousness about them. I wouldn't always call it anger, but they're tapping into something, right? Like real frustrations and grievances. So in that sense, I think there's that's a kind of people again will use that as an insult, as a pejorative. I just think it's just so people put their cards on the table when they do that. And again, so when these people will frame Poilievre as this kind of terrifying populist, it's going to destroy the Canada we know and love, something along those lines. And I don't even mean this. It's funny. I got some of the responses to the article thought I was defending Poilievre. Someone thought I was attacking Poilievre. I was honestly not trying to do either of those things. I was just trying to make the observation that, like, look, he might have this. It might be fair to describe him as a populist, but it really is everything he's offering right now is fairly kind of milquetoast, certainly within the kind of narrow boundaries of what's acceptable in Canadian discourse. Right? He really isn't challenging any of the kind of real, the various many third rails or taboos of Canadian politics. I don't think it's hard to say that Poilievre is really challenging anything like that, or that any of the kind of for the most part, any of the populist movements we have in this country right now, there's people here and there that certainly challenge kind of, these third rails, but there's certainly no major kind of figures or movement, I think, that really do, right? So, I think so much of this discourse is so sloppy and so lazy, and that if we think more carefully about these terms and we actually try and have kind of serious discussions and analyses of what we're talking about here, it really kind of changes what you're maybe it doesn't change your view of someone like Poilievre, but it certainly might temper your fears or your expectations, right?
Yeah, well, and if there's any hallmark, I guess you could say, of a malignant populism, when a leader or a figure is trying to incite or get the people up against, they like to take advantage of xenophobia, and immigration or foreigners is often a tempting target for them. And you kind of go into that as well, at least whatever may be going on with Poilievre. Immigration hasn't been an area where he's been radical or trying to stir up any sort of negative movements of any sort.
No, exactly. And to be, I should say, as a first generation immigrant myself, I am, I'm quite pleased with that, right? So I'm not opposed to immigration. I think we can certainly have debates about, the number of immigrants we have, but it's amazing that even we had a record number of immigrants to Canada last year. It was about 400,000. And again, we don't need to necessarily have an argument about specific numbers, right? But the idea that is kind of beyond the pale of public discourse, I've always thought is kind of very strange, right? Like these are certainly questions people should be able to ask and not be kind of terrified of, what they'll be accused of being if they bring it up. But yeah, that was I tried to make that point in the piece that Poilievre's not challenging that, right? If anything, he's trying to appeal to immigrant communities, which again I don't think is a bad thing, right? I think that's probably a good thing, especially if he wants to win an election. But again, he's being some of the people he's been compared to, right? Like people like Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen. Like the idea that what Poilievre is saying there would be kind of acceptable to the most hardcore, most devoted supporters of someone like Trump, for example. It's just kind of silly, right? Like these are different people, and we should stop engaging with. We should stop using these kind of lazy comparisons. One other kind of the piece in question was fairly long. I won't say it was short. There was actually a separate section that got cut just for space constraints. And one of the other kind of immigration is obviously one of the third rails of Canadian politics. The other, and I think it's going to be we're going to be having discussions about this in the very near future again, is abortion, right? Again, it's just kind of an tend to be a descriptive observation. Lewis, I think, is going to be a guest later, right? Leslyn Lewis, who's kind of the social conservative in the conservative leadership race right now. She's the pro-life option. But again, if you actually go and look at what she's proposing and what she's campaigning on, it's fairly modest stuff in terms of what so there's a ban on sex-selective abortions. There's, I think, a ban on like overseas funding for abortions. But even Leslyn Lewis, the social conservative, the pro-life MP in the race, she would never even think to propose something like. It amazes me when I talk to Canadians and they think that we have kind of when you tell them about like European style how abortion is generally regulated in Europe versus America. Most European countries, I think the abortion limit is around 12 weeks. It varies a little bit, but that's fairly early on, right? In a pregnancy, it's basically at the end of the first trimester. But Leslyn Lewis, our radical, scary social, the one that's going to put us back to theocracy. If you listen to certain people, she's not proposing, like a French style or European style abortion limits. What she's proposing are pretty small, not unambitious and modest restrictions by comparison. So on all sorts of these topics, right, these third rail topics, these taboos, we really don't have like true radical challenges to them. Again, there might be voices here and there, but there certainly isn't like kind of mainstream organized movement that challenges these things. We have this fairly narrow, and I would suggest, for better or for worse, I'd say for worse on many things, this very narrow and very stable consensus on all sorts of topics.
Yeah, and as you said, and I'm glad you brought it up. Ms. Lewis's position on abortion actually is really where a lot of American Democrats would land. I mean, she would be considered pretty moderate compared to some of the more activist Republicans amongst the bunch. But to even broach the issue immediately starts getting that pushback. And I mean, is that a bit of a cultural thing within Canada too? Although, I mean, are we afraid of substantial change? Like, is that why populism as a pejorative is as effective as it can be sometimes when it's used against people? Because we don't embrace any large radical changes, or at least we haven't traditionally. We talk big, but as you said, even when these people get into power who did it on a populist wave, they don't tend to really change a whole heck of a lot structurally or substantially once they get there.
Yeah, that's my kind of. I think this is true not just in Canada, but in other places. I think Canada is generally a more maybe kind of temperamentally modest, right, place. I don't think Canadians, I think, are much less quick to kind of anger and rage maybe than other places. And I think sometimes that's good, and I think sometimes that's bad, right? I think sometimes we should get angry about things that we kind of just let governments get away with. I think it's even there's obviously kind of structural reasons, right? Why sometimes changes are just hard to make, right? There's a kind of status quo that is a status quo for a reason, right? It's entrenched. And there's in the desire to, it takes real, if there's some sort of major reform you want to embark on, it's going to take real significant kind of desire and will and kind of motivation to do it. So in many ways, kind of just a kind of benign status quo prevails, not so much because it's popular, but just because kind of the effort to undo it or change it would take a lot of work in the other way. We could go through issue by issue, right? There's all sorts of things that there are things in Canada that I would like to see changed. It doesn't mean that's going to happen, right? It's just kind of a real, just unfortunate or fortunate, depending on your perspective, and unfortunate reality about how this country works. I think one kind of major problem we have in Canada is we do have, and this was again kind of a broader kind of point about this piece, is we do have a very narrow kind of, I don't want to get too technical, but people sometimes call the Overton window, right? We really do have a kind of narrow window of what is generally considered acceptable opinions. So plenty of people might hold opinions that are actually kind of, outside that fairly narrow window. But especially in kind of media and kind of discourse, that window is so narrow that people that hold those perspectives might either not express them at all, or just kind of very subtly kind of hint at it here and there, but be kind of worried about kind of the consequences of saying so. I mean, if regardless of whether maybe even if someone generally likes kind of the status quo in Canada today, I would suggest we'd actually benefit from having a kind of wider discourse where there's just a wider range of kind of permitted, acceptable opinion, precisely so that we can actually have more kind of serious engagements and debates over kind of major issues and major topics. I don't think Canada's well served at all by having kind of a very narrow, kind of very thin consensus, because it really just allows a lot of kind of complacency and shallow and sloppy thinking, right? So again, even if we generally like kind of, broadly speaking, the kind of consensus in Canada, I think we benefit from a more open culture where we can actually have debates about things that maybe, people don't want to have debates about right now for various reasons.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. We have an opportunity right now with a leadership race where hopefully you get a number of people to talk about some of the individual issues. And if we keep playing I like your use of the term, it's just being lazy by dismissing this as populism here or there and not having the conversation. It doesn't mean you have to like or dislike whatever a candidate's saying, but we need to open up that discourse rather than keep being so polarized and shutting it down with simplistic terms, I guess you could say. So I appreciate you coming on to expand a bit on that. And where could we find more information on what you're writing and what you're doing? That piece that caught my eye was in the Hub. You're active elsewhere as well?
Yeah, I generally write for the Hub these days. So the Hub is where you'll see my writing fairly frequently. I'm in the National Post fairly frequently. And if you want to just keep track of what I'm doing, I have a Twitter account you can follow. It's just my name, @Ben Woodfinden. And I have a newsletter as well, a Substack that I do. I've kind of, it's not super active, but it's, it's all public stuff. So if people want to go back and read some kind of older things I've written, they're welcome to check that out. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you again for taking some time to talk to us today. And I look forward to reading more of your pieces. Perhaps we'll talk again down the road.
Cheers. Yeah, would love to be on again. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. So that was Ben Woodfinden. And as you said, look it up. Check it out. He's got a lot of great stuff written out there. And it'll be Dr. Ben Woodfinden fairly soon by the sounds of things with his studies and endeavors. So, and again, I just like seeing some nuanced political discourse. And, you know my rants on this show. I get people worked up and go issue by issue. But at the same time, there can be room to talk about things issue by issue. And as he said, it's lazy, it's wasteful. Oh, that person's a populist. So then suddenly it's not worth talking about anymore. Well, that's not right. That's not a good way to open these things up or look into them and follow further. So either way, it was good to have Ben on there to talk about a little bit of that. Let me get we got such a packed show today. I want to make sure I cover our sponsors. So another one of our sponsors I talk about every day is the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. I can imagine their email inbox this last few weeks has been pretty busy. I mean, we have an assault against our ability to use and enjoy and, possess firearms like we haven't seen since the early 90s with Trudeau's handgun freeze and his plans on recategorizing even more firearms. Well, the Canadian Shooting Sports Association is a group. Their name's sort of self-explanatory. They're an association of people who enjoy shooting sports. And that can mean anything from collecting, target shooting by athletes. I mean, that's a fantastic sport. You cross country along and then you're heavy breathing and trying to shoot a target in distance. All of those things. And they provide the resources, safe utilization. They give lists for where events are. And most important of all, they advocate on your behalf. They educate, they push back against these moves to take away this fine, ability to be able to utilize firearms safely. Because it's the law-abiding ones, it's the ones in the association are the ones we always get cracked down on when some lunatic, unfortunately, goes out and does the worst possible thing. Speaking of nuanced discussions, law-abiding firearmers are as repelled and disgusted when they see shootings and armed robberies and terrible things like that as anybody else, if not more, because that it's going to come back on us. So this is where we get together. This is where you organize. You got to join, though. You got to take out a membership. That's the only way to stand up for yourself, is to join together and do that. And you can do that at the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Their website is cssa-cila.org, or just Google them up and take out a membership, because, again, if you don't stand up for your rights, nobody's going to do it on your behalf. They're trying, but they need your help. All right, I'm just going to look a little over at the comment scroll and see, lots of discussion on the dogs. I'm going to have more of that talk next week, and that I want to get some guests on to talk about that sort of thing and stuff like that. I want it to be nuanced. I mean, we cover that a lot on the show. Everybody knows I'm an animal lover. Irresponsible animal owners drive me nuts, similar to the firearm things, right? As somebody else was pointing out, this was a trio of dogs. I mean, there's things that happen. I see that with those meatheads in my own house, though they don't get violent. When dogs get together, as people are talking about the pack mentality, and there's truth to it, they can stir each other up. It gets worse and worse. And in this case, it led to them, dogs that probably, I wouldn't be surprised, were typically very friendly prior, but then worked themselves into a frenzy. But it's still unforgivable. There's a problem. I mean, a person died. We have to look into that. How did this happen? How do we stop this? And in other cases like that. So we'll have more talk about that in the future, because there are some strong points of views from a number of people on it. I mean, we saw an awful outcome. I feel terrible for, 3 dogs. They're saying they're still in custody of the Humane Society for now. But we know those ones are going to be put down. I don't like seeing dogs put down either. And, but again, this is too dangerous. You can't keep them after that's happened. That's just the way it goes. People come first. People still always come first. Even though I like dogs more than I like people, I understand legislatively, the people still come first. Okay, let's look at some news stuff as well, going beyond that. And that's, Dave mentioned that, the CRTC disapproval level now at 22%. A quarter of Canadians disapprove of the CRTC, and that's the Canadian Radio Television Commission, or Canadian Radio Television and Telecommunications Commission. They make it bigger and bigger, it seems, all the time. The CRTC, it's been around a long time, and they've been pushing to control the internet now. I mean, I remember way back at the end of the 90s, there was this big report put out by the CRTC, because people were concerned then. They're saying, we've decided right now we're not going to regulate the internet. What it really meant was, we don't like all that information being shared, but we can't figure out how to regulate the internet. So we're just going to pretend that we're going to leave it alone for the time being. Either way, it's gotten worse. And, we've had Peter Menzies on before. He was with the CRTC. I mean, there were days when it was common sense, when there was a need of regulation, and watching radio broadcasts, things like that. But now it's gone bad, and the government's using it as a tool to control information. And with 22% of Canadians disapproving it, which is kind of interesting, because I bet you a few years ago, you'd be hard-pressed to find 22% of Canadians who even really know what the CRTC is. So this organization that really kind of operated in the background of government for a long, long time is now starting to become front and center. And what people are seeing, they aren't liking. I mean, how often do you see any bureaucracy where aside from perhaps the Canadian Revenue Agency, where a lot of people all at once would say, no, I actually do not like that agency whatsoever. And in the case of the CRTC, we're looking at almost a quarter of Canadians surveying say they have an unfavorable opinion of this, which is really just a bureaucratic regulatory body. But that's because of all these announcements. They're going after YouTube videos and the Broadcasting Act, and they're going after independent media like ourselves, shows like this. C11, C18, these liberal bills of control are coming after us, and they're using the CRTC as a tool to try and control information. Always fear when they try to control information. Here's just from commenter Brad. Brad there saying, "Good afternoon, Cory. Andrew Scheer had a good video on this." Okay, so perhaps look up Andrew Scheer and the CRTC and some of their things. There's certainly more to look into, but it's interesting, like I said, what's usually kind of a benign background sort of government bureaucracy. There's many, many of them out there, and suddenly it's actually catching interest, and people are not impressed with it. And it's I guess we could look at it as heartening too. It means more Canadians are paying attention to some of these issues. This is the frustration of this show. This is where we feel like we're screaming into the wind sometimes. And I know in a few minutes I'm going to have my next guest on, and this is a gentleman who's been screaming into the wind about the ambulance coverage in Alberta for years now. I mean, I was looking up some stuff that Mr. Porter had been doing in news articles from 7 years ago, talking about what we're seeing now. We knew this yet, and people are still trying, and I appreciate that they're still trying to change things. Eventually, we can hope that enough people finally pay attention, and hopefully with as few tragedies as possible to catch people's eyes and make them realize something has to change. It's difficult to make change. It's frustrating. You feel like you're beating your head against the wall. But one thing you can be guaranteed is nothing will change if you give up. That's an assurance. You'll lose for sure if you don't try. So we're going to talk about one of those frustrating things. But the apathy of Canadians is our own worst enemy. Let's look into a little bit more news copy here before we move on to the guest segment, though. Oil demand has been, here's the beauty. It's expected to remain steady through 2030, says the Department of the Environment. Of course it is. We've been talking about this for years. It's funny that they suddenly realized this. We're seeing some of that online. You remember it wasn't that long ago. So many activists and people, when the oil prices went low, said, that's it, it's done. Oil demand is never coming back. The world's moved off oil. Let's transition. Give up your oil field jobs. Move along. It's done. No, it's not. And every economist worth their salt, every energy analyst worth their salt has already said, no, we need oil and gas as much as we ever have. In fact, we anticipate the demand is going to grow for quite some time. And it seems the Department of Environment has suddenly just realized that. This is the stuff that starts to get me a little bit worried, though. This is when I start to get a little bit worried. I've talked about that before on this show. I've talked about history repeating itself. I've talked about stuff that happens in Canada. And this looks so much right now like it did in the late 70s, early 80s, when interest rates were through the roof, inflation was going crazy, we had an odious Trudeau in power, and for decades, Alberta had been trying to get its oil out east, and Eastern leadership kept saying, no, keep your oil out in Alberta. We don't want it. We can get it cheaper from Venezuela, Saudi Arabia. And then suddenly when the prices went through the roof, suddenly Alberta's oil was Canada's oil. Suddenly, whoa, you guys have got to share it with us. We can't be paying these high prices at the pump while you're pumping it out of the ground out there. Oh dear, this is a problem. This is a catastrophe. We're going to bring in the National Energy Program and make it fair. You love that word fair, right? For everybody. So now we've got, it's unfortunate. It shows my mistrust, I guess you could say, with the government in general. When I see a positive release, I guess in a sense from them, it seems to make some common sense with accepting that demand is going to be rising for at least 8-10 more years, at least. And that's coming from a government bureaucracy. But it also worries me that it's because they're setting the stage to do something untowards for us out in the West with it. But we'll wait and see. I mean, we saw also that they're still not too eager to bring stuff along. They approved, the Bay du Nord offshore oil project in Newfoundland with no problems there. But they still shut down an expansion of an Alberta oil sands project. So again, their liking of Western oil still hasn't grown too terribly much. But maybe some reality will start to drift in with our federal masters, and maybe this is some of the first signs of it, right? As I said, there's only, 5% of the country, even though years and years they've been working on it, have gone into electric vehicles. So they got to accept the big transition isn't going to happen right away. Maybe one day, but not right away. All right, well, I see my guest in the lobby there, George Porter. If he's ready, I'll bring him in. And we want to talk about AHS ambulance service within Alberta and basically just kind of the mess we've made of it. And Mr. Porter is a veteran paramedic in Alberta who's been on this subject for quite some time. I saw him at a town hall meeting, I believe, in Okotoks. It would have been August, I think. And hearing about all the things we're still hearing about today. So thank you very much for joining us today, Mr. Porter.
Well, thank you, Cory. I appreciate your interest in this and keeping it front and center and having me here.
Yeah, so I mean, I do want to state, we had a recent tragedy that's kind of brought ambulance services to the fore, but we're still finding out details, so we'll kind of stay out of those weeds. I mean, it might have been a dispatch issue, it might have been a number of things that happened there. There's certainly some investigation has to happen because something clearly went terribly wrong and had the worst possible outcome. But it's brought the issue of timely medical service to the forefront, which if you could look at it as a positive development in a sense, now's the time to get out there and talk to people and make them realize that we're all this vulnerable and we very soon could see another tragedy like this as somebody dies waiting for medical service.
Well, Cory, people need to understand that this is not an isolated incident. These things are happening on a regular basis. It's been just a short while ago, a woman in Calgary watched her husband bleed to death for an hour before an ambulance showed up. They disconnected a call because they had calls stacked up waiting and they couldn't keep her on the line. So they did an emergency disconnect. I've responded to one myself. My longest response time is 1 hour and 17 minutes for a chest pain collapse. turned out to be an old friend of mine. And yeah, it's been a few years ago. And so these things are going on a regular basis. It's just ones like this that tend to hit the media and become an issue. And Alberta Health and EMS management response is, it's when you don't have an excuse or when you don't have a solution, Cory, you make excuses. And that's all we've seen for years.
Well, and the frustrating part is, though, there are solutions, and you've been proposing solutions, and they don't want to hear them. I mean, there's some aspects that come up, from how they did change and centralize the authorities. So suddenly rural ambulances are being all drawn into the urban centers and leaving us without coverage. Well, we didn't have a problem before. The solution is go back to when it was working. I mean, that's one of the ones I think we could kind of work towards. We had something, it wasn't broke, they tried to fix it, and now we're stranded.
Well, show me any government program that runs effectively and efficiently. And this is certainly part of that. It's we used to be cutting edge. We used to be leading edge in EMS in this province, and we can't even keep up. It's just been so frustrating and discouraging to see the failures and how far down this has fallen with no action. We have no leadership. We have no leadership in EMS. We have no leadership in Alberta Health Services. All we get is excuses and stats, and well, you can make stats say anything you want, but nobody does anything. Nobody will stand up and do the right thing for the staff or for patient care.
And that's exacerbating the problem. I mean, we're even hearing from other facets saying, "Oh, we just need more money. We need more resources because we're shorthanded." Well, there's some truth to that, but they're wearing out existing paramedics through this. I imagine the stress of being in such a broken system, isn't keeping staff retention very high.
Oh, we have, last I heard was 42% of the medics are booked off. A lot of them they're just exhausted. They're worn out, and AHS, EMS comes on the news once in a while, pats everybody on the head, says how much they love the medics, aren't they wonderful? But they don't have their back, and the medics know that. And we've had a few brave medics that stand up and even using AHS's own data, and they get suspended. And one of them, while he's suspended for a week, his ambulance is out of service because they got no staff to man it. We got 350, 400 shifts a week in this province that are uncovered. They don't have enough medics. And if they did have enough medics, they don't have enough ambulances anymore.
Well, and then that's something you did bring up, I believe, again, at that town hall I went to, was the discipline on anybody who speaks up. Like, there's no real whistleblower legislation or anything to protect somebody from within the system. If they speak up, they find themselves out of a job, which only adds to the problem. Yep.
There's consequences for speaking up, and I guess that's why I've been riding this poor tired old horse for going on 13 years lobbying for this, Cory. Years. And you mean to tell me that there's not one manager, and I can't call them leaders, there's not one manager in AHS or EMS that's been able to come up with a single idea, a single solution in going on 13 years to fix this? Cory, most of this stuff could be turned around in 24 hours if we had a leader, if we had some will, if we had a desire. It's difficult to change legislation, but they did it last week. They said we don't have enough staff, so boom, they decide that EMRs can now work ambulance. Emergency medical responders can work with EMTs and paramedics in ambulance because we don't have enough staff. If the will is there, it can happen overnight. But they spend so much time and energy maintaining this dysfunctional status quo, they can spend a fraction of that effort and fix it.
Well, and then one of the things that even a layperson like me can see that I would think should be relatively easy to solve I wrote I've written a number of columns on this over the last year and change. So for a picture for it, Nico's pulled it up a couple of times. I just pulled by the Rocky View Hospital. It was just a random time in the middle of the day to have a look. I pulled around back by the emergency area, and outside I could see, I believe, 5 or 6 ambulances all parked. And then within the enclosed garage area, it looked like there were possibly as many as half a dozen more sitting in there. And that's not an ambulance depot. That's not a storage spot. That's an emergency department. So I can only assume there's paramedics associated with those ambulances all sitting around doing hallway care in that hospital rather than being out in the streets taking care of people in emergency situations. Like, what is it going to take to force the issue to say, look, these aren't nurses, these aren't doctors, these are emergency care professionals. Take these patients and let them get back to work.
They say the medics can't leave because that's potentially patient abandonment. Well, Cory, those people are in the safest place they can be. They're in a tertiary care facility. We do have a patient abandonment issue, and that's the patients that are calling 911 and waiting for that elusive ambulance to show up. Those are the patients that are being abandoned. Those are the patients that we have no business. EMS has no business treating patients in a hospital hallway. That's not our job. We don't have the resources. And when we're doing that, we can't be out on the street where we're supposed to be. And those are moral injuries for these medics. They know what's going on. They know there's 30, 40 calls stacked up waiting for an ambulance to clear some place to respond. And all you get from AHS and EMS is gaslighting. You get them coming on media on a regular basis saying, you know, in spite of what you're hearing, we always have an ambulance available to respond, and you, lucky Albertan, get the closest ambulance. And the general public says, what's Porter talking about? Everything's good. It's true. We do have an ambulance available to respond to Calgary right now, even though they might be in code red. But that nearest available ambulance might be Fort McMurray. And we're seeing response times more and more and more, an hour, 2 hours. Last one I'm aware of was an ambulance dispatch from 3 hours and 20 minutes away to respond to an emergency in Edmonton. We see ambulances in Lethbridge responding to emergencies in Calgary. I've seen so many times when there's not a single ambulance available to respond between Area Crossfield and Lethbridge. They're doing routine transfers. They're stuck in a hospital hallway someplace. It's absolutely asinine.
And that's another issue that came up too, is using ambulances fully staffed with paramedics for non-emergent transportation of patients. Like, why is it impossible just to get a lightly equipped vehicle to move somebody rather than taking these specialized emergency vehicles off the streets?
I hear things like that all the time, Cory, from people like yourself, people, non-EMS people come up with perfectly viable solutions. Heck, I see the other day that the AHS is leaning on the public for ideas on how to solve the EMS crisis. What the heck are we paying these managers, our supposed leaders, for? We're going to the public for ideas on how to fix this. We have to form a committee. We have to form task forces. We have to have studies to figure out how to solve this. It's plain as the day is long, Cory. Get those crews out of the hospital hallways so they can do their job. Quit using ambulances inappropriately. I mean, the union solution to everything is, well, we need more ambulances. We need more medics. Likely we do. But until you start using what we have appropriately, you don't know what you need. And you could put 50 more staffed ambulances on the road tomorrow, and the only thing that would result is you got 50 more stacked up in a hospital hallway.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a big problem with a bunch of levels. But I mean, is there then a short staffing in the hospital emergency areas for the hospital staff that's making them this reliant, or?
It's mostly a bed issue. And I don't pretend to be an expert in the hospital problems. I've got a lot of ideas that could go towards solving some of that, but that's not my area of expertise. And EMS, I told management 13 years ago, I said, as long as you're willing to let those crews sit in a hospital hallway, nothing will change. Why would it? Why would the hospital do anything different if you're covering their shortcomings, their shortfall? We have no business being there. We have no business being there. And if EMS management did just that one thing today, it would be a huge step towards solving a lot of these issues.
So dispatch is another area of debate going on right now and concern. And it sounds like with the recent incident, that was definitely something went wrong with dispatch and communication. So everybody's pointing their fingers at each other. And I've been finding it pretty repugnant watching them all playing the blame game, when right now we've got a person who needlessly died, and you should be seeking bloody solutions rather than trying to blame everybody for it. But Something I'd heard before is one of the things with 911 that they will not and cannot tell you ever is how far away is help once you've called. Like, I'm just imagining if I were on the scene and I had this poor woman bleeding to death in front of me, and I phoned and they said, well, it's going to be half an hour. You know what? I'll get the stains on my seat. I'll pack her in the back of my car and drive her the 8 minutes it was to Foothills Hospital so she can get treatment, rather than sit here and watch her bleed to death. Why not let citizens get a little proactive then in these cases? But they won't do it. As far as you know, there's always somebody 1 minute away.
Yep, that's exact. And there was a day when that was true. And those days are long gone. And that is something that we're pushing with our citizen action groups and different meetings we have is people, you need to have a plan B. You're right. The dispatchers should be telling you how far away that ambulance is and giving you the opportunity to look after yourself. People, you need to have a plan B because EMS cannot respond in a timely manner like we used to be able to.
But it just seems like a ridiculous rule too. You know, I mean, why are you keeping people in the dark on something as simple as just how long is this emergency service going to be? It seems like more one of those butt covering sorts of rules rather than anything to help anybody else, just so people don't actually know how screwed up it is.
Yep. The friend that I alluded to that I responded to that's about an hour and a half, he had a pulse and was breathing for 20 minutes after he went down. They repeatedly called dispatch. You know, should we just put him in the van, take him to the hospital? We're 20 minutes away. And they said, no, the ambulance is on its way, knowing that I was well over an hour away from that location. And we got people, we got ambulance crews responding, lights and siren, ridiculous distances. I got a text the other day from a girl, she was in tears, responding over an hour away for a cardiac arrest. They're doing CPR on this guy. That's putting these crews at risk, driving high speed, lights and siren. It's putting other motorists on the road at risk. For what? What are you going to do when you get there an hour and 10 minutes later? If you're doing CPR now, it's absolutely asinine.
Even a person with the most rudimentary of first aid training knows that, I mean, just time is of the essence in a number of life-threatening scenarios that can be easily solved with the right resources. I mean, anaphylactic shock, cardiac issues, bleeding. I mean, these are things that your average layperson on the street might not be able to do something about, but an ambulance can very readily, stabilize somebody. But if they're waiting too bloody long, then there's no point.
Yeah. Well, what are we doing? Why are we even responding to things like that? And, you know, as crass as it sounds, as I said, you know, you guys need to phone your supervisor, tell dispatch you're not going. Like, send the funeral home, as harsh as that is, because that's the reality of it. And, you know, this poor gal that had the dog attack, and I feel so bad for that, and so angry when I heard that. And you're right, there's lots of finger pointing. So release the tapes. Release the time shots. You know, why not?
Yeah, well, maybe it's time, and that's one of the things is demand our provincial leaders. That's one of the things they can do is start a real investigation, not an internal one. Let's have a task force. Get on this bloody thing, you know, subpoena those sorts of things. Let's expose it.
Well, Minister Copping announces that AHS investigated themselves on this, and he's happy to announce that we didn't do anything wrong. Everything's good. And so that gets swept under the carpet like all these other terrible tragedies that have happened, and we continue doing nothing. There needs to be a house cleaning.
And I could tell the frustration in your voice, and it's with all of us. But I mean, as I said, kind of at the start, I mean, we got to keep trying. I mean, we
absolutely
win otherwise. And right now, they are in the middle of a leadership race. It's one of the few times that you get a bunch of them actually paying a little bit of attention. So hopefully some people can make this an issue with those candidates and say, hey, take a stance on this. Let's document your stance on it. Let's get your word on this, because we're going to follow up on it. And let's change this damn mess, because this is just not acceptable and it's ridiculous.
And enough studies, enough committees, enough. Just do what needs to be done. It's simple. This could be, as I said before, this could be corrected in no time, could be turned around. Just, if we had some leadership. We have no leadership at any level.
Well, I'll be interviewing probably most, if not all, of the candidates over the next couple of months for the leadership, and you can rest assured I'll be bringing this one up with them. Is there more you're going to be doing with your organization? Like, where can people find information on how they can try to take part and keep this issue alive and make some change?
A lot of communities, particularly around Calgary, have citizen action committees, citizen action groups. Some are very active. Cochrane, you had Brian Winters on your show here a while back. You guys did a wonderful job on that program. Brian's a good guy to contact, Cochrane. People need to understand that when, they talk about code reds, when Calgary doesn't have any ambulances available to respond. Nobody talks about rural code reds. But people need to understand when Calgary's in code red with no ambulances, you can be guaranteed there's not an available ambulance within probably 100 kilometers outside of Calgary, because they've all been sucked into the city and are sitting in hospital hallways or doing calls in the city. It's not just an urban problem. And,
I'm well aware of it.
That's why you see these things where the whole southern half of Alberta's got no available ambulance to respond.
Yeah. I live in Pritis, and our ambulance is basically seems to come back to town for oil changes and then goes back to the city.
Yep, you're absolutely right.
All right. Well, thank you for the work you're doing and trying to keep going on this. And thanks for coming on to talk to us about it today. Hopefully, one way or another, we can hammer some common sense into them out there and get some positive changes.
Well, thank you, Cory. And I told management all these years ago that I would be here until this was fixed. And in my wildest dreams, I wouldn't have believed that all these years later, I'd still be beating this same drum. But I'll be here till this is done.
Right on. Well, thank you very much, George. And maybe the next time we talk, we'll have something positive to talk about.
Here's hoping. Thanks, Cory. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yep.
So yes, it's George Porter. And as I said, yeah, there's a lot of media stories of him online. He's taken part with others, throughout Cochrane and down the south, and holding town hall meetings and trying to bring this out. And yeah, the rural aspect, there's just so much to cover. 15 minutes, 20 minutes isn't enough. And this is multifaceted. This system is falling apart and underserving people on a lot of levels. And the rural areas, yeah, we are in terrible trouble. And you got to think too, I mean, we don't necessarily have large trauma centers near us in these rural areas. Having that ability to transport people is more acute down there than even in the city. I mean, it's going to be a longer haul to get to a hospital automatically just because of where you are. And meanwhile, there's nothing around. And that Health Services Association of Alberta, if you look them up, and if you're on Twitter, I mean, it's been great. At least they keep pointing it out. They keep putting those nice Google graphics up there showing, hey, check this out. They're dispatching an ambulance from Banff to go to Northeast Calgary, or they're sending one from Brooks to go to Airdrie. Like, it's ridiculous. And of course, what happens then when there's an accident in Banff? I mean, you're sucking it from somewhere else. You're leaving another potential catastrophe behind you. And how, as I said, you could see the frustration from Mr. Porter. How has it taken this long just to address this? I mean, people are screaming it from the rooftops. They're holding the meetings. People are dying. Staff are burning out. And there's solutions. This isn't something terribly complicated. As he said, there's a number of changes you could do in 5 minutes that will start to take the pressure off. I mean, sure, there's bigger systematic changes that have to be made and other things, but there are immediate things right in front of us that we can be doing. And we won't do it. There's this stubborn, entrenched protection of the status quo, this fear of shaking anything up. Plus, the part that infuriated me at that town hall meeting I went to as well was hearing about a paramedic who'd been disciplined and shut down for daring to speak up. So, I mean, they're trying to silence the discourse. You don't try to silence them. You find out what's wrong. And just all over the place. It's just maddening. So let's get on to some other stuff. As as George is going to keep on it, I assure you I will too. As I said, I've written a number of columns on this one, and I'm going to carry on with it. And anytime I can point to good resources, I will. And as I said, I'm going to keep pressing these leadership candidates on this. Because, one of the things, it's an opportunity, I tell you, to get to these candidates when you can. That's when they're most receptive, and corner them and get a hard answer. And if you get whoever it might be who's running for the leadership, and they said during one of these shows, yes, I'm going to change that. I'm going to give it back to the municipalities. I'm going to bring in legislation to just outright stop hallway care. Well, if a year later they haven't done it, that's when you pull up that interview and say, hey, Premier, what the hell's goes here? What's going on? Why didn't you do this? You said this. Did you lie? you can put their feet to the fire. It's a strategy. You have to use strategy. I mean, these politicians will blow sunshine up your butt and avoid committing to anything if they can possibly get away with it. But you don't have to let them get away with it. Part of it, lands on us. I mean, I know it's not for lack of effort on George's part that things aren't getting done, and he's still carrying on at it. But we've all got to get on them. We got to get on their cases. We got to keep pressuring them because they won't budge without a foot against their butt. That's just the hard reality of it with bureaucracies, with things like this, and we got too much going on. Let's see. Let's get on to some other news before Ms. Lewis comes on, which should be any moment now. This is something, speaking of exhaustion and tiresome and going on. So here we are going into summer, looking forward to what might be one of the better, not Jason Kenney's best summer ever, say, of last year, but just it looks like for the most part, the pandemic's behind us. It's been considered endemic. It's still out there. It's still making some people sick. It's still harming some folks, but we're at the point where we can start living again. We're not masking up. We're traveling. We're seeing family. We're going to sporting events. But we've always got those finger-wagging health experts, and there she is, Dr. Theresa Tam, and right at the beginning of this summer, wagging her finger saying, we're going to have a 7th wave this fall. It's very likely. So, get ready for it, guys. Don't relax. Don't enjoy life. Don't kick back because, it's coming. And she says in her own statement, we can't predict exactly how big it's going to be. Well, then shut up. God, you got to keep us afraid all the time. We're sick and tired of it. And you know what is going to happen, I fear? Because, viruses are real. Pandemics are real. Something really big is going to come down the pipe. And by then, people will have lost so much trust in authorities, so much with the government, and so much with these health clowns like Tam, that even when the warnings come out saying, guys, you do have to get into your houses, you do have to avoid contact, we do have to get this under control, it's really going to hurt people, people aren't going to believe them. They aren't going to comply, and a very serious pandemic is really going to knock people on their butt. It goes all the way back to the old children's story of the boy that cried wolf. There's Brenda. Yeah, I just saw the commenter from it. Boy that cried wolf. I understand. Tam has to watch these things and speak to these things. That's her job. But fear-mongering isn't her bloody job. And right now, we aren't in a crisis point, so quit trying to create one. Quit trying to keep people like this. It's not helping. And, I swear, some of these health experts, these ones we see, whether, it's Hinshaw or Tam or some of the others, they're going to miss this pandemic. These were, how often in the past, how often 10 years ago could anybody name their chief medical officer provincially or federally? You never heard of these guys. These were basement bureaucrats. They were dorks. They were down there tracking syphilis outbreaks at high school dances. And suddenly they're in the spotlight. They're the most important bureaucrat in the country. They're getting the coverage. They're getting the adoration even. I remember a while back there were T-shirts being made with hearts for Dina Hinshaw. And there's been some unfair abuse on some of these health professionals too. They're just trying to do a job, but we also have turned them into heroes. And they're medical bureaucrats, guys. Let's not forget that. And it doesn't mean we always have to berate and beat on them, but at the same time, they've got to remember what their role is. And that role is not to be out there being a mouthpiece for whatever politician pays your bills. You're supposed to stick to your job. And but no, they're starting the fear machine up. And I don't think it's going to have an impact. That's the other thing I talked about a little while back and was with, it sounds like there's a push on to redefine what fully vaccinated is and making it 3 shots. And if they do that, well, despite all the reminders and all the pushing and everything else, less than half of Canadians have gotten their 3rd shot, their booster. People are getting complacent. They're getting tired of being pushed and told around. And I've said it before, I support vaccination. I support free choice in vaccination. There's a big difference between the two. I don't support mandates. I don't support a lot of these things. But I think it's a good idea to get vaccinated. I know the commenters are all going to go wild on me on that. You always do. That's okay. That's okay. We don't have to agree on it. What we can agree on is it has to be a choice. And with every one of these subsequent mandates, though, people are choosing not to. That's what I mean. The trust is dropping. You had 86% of people get the first 2 shots and less than half have gotten the 3rd one because they're tired out. They don't see the risk as being as great as what we'd always been warned it would be. And if they keep up with this fear mongering, you're going to have a hell of a time trying to get compliance with health orders down the road if something very seriously occurs. And I think it's a matter of time before something serious occurs. I don't know. It's way outside of my expertise, but I just look at general things. We got billions of people around the world. We do know that viruses mutate, they change, they spread. We get new diseases. These diseases disappear. Something's going to come. We should be learning from this pandemic so that we can better address the next one instead of desperately clinging to it and trying to make this thing last forever. So, yeah, I don't know. When I see those stories, I just feel my own shoulders just sort of shrug and drop with exhaustion. Like you guys just aren't going to let us off the hook. And Canada's one of the worst. I mean, I've talked about that. It's killing our tourism. It's damaging us on all sorts of levels. I mean, we've got, the only mask mandates on planes left on the planet. We're one of the only ones with these vaccine mandates to be able to fly domestically, and it's backing up our airports. We're seeing those scenes all over the place. People aren't coming here. And are we seeing, that's the thing, if they say follow the science, well, let's follow the science. On the countries that have opened up, the countries that have allowed air travel without masks, air travel within their countries without vaccination, have there been massive, uncontrollable outbreaks because of that? No, they haven't. In fact, it kind of makes you wonder just how negligible some of these health measures are in the first place. So, cut it out, but we don't want to. We're still hung up on this thing. Let's see, I'm afraid Ms. Lewis appears to be late. Hopefully she comes on soon, but we'll see. We'll continue to talk about some other things. Let's see, Judge, this one's a kind of an odd one. Judges, and Dave mentioned that too, I think, or maybe that was in the news meeting this morning. Judge is reopening a Senate probe into racial discrimination in the Senate. This is odd, so it was a 2015 firing of the first South Asian individual to be appointed a manager in the Senate administration. I mean, it says quite something. I mean, there's a lot of South Asian, that's people from India and that area and that in Canada. I mean, lots of professionals and very active Canadians. It took that long for somebody to even get into a managerial position in the Senate. I guess that kind of says something. I'm not sure what. But that person did get dismissed for some reason. And 7 years in, now we're into still an inquiry pushing on this. This was the director of human resources at the Senate, fired after 2 years on the job. I guess some of the question, though, was this person fired because of their race, or was it just that this person wasn't very good? These are one of the things that needs the investigation. It's making the news, though, on the story. I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much on that one. Maybe there was discrimination. Maybe there wasn't. It's an internal thing. I'm just reading the news as I get it. So speaking of moving in the right direction a little bit, here's another story that's decent. Looks like at least Ontario's top doctors remained, better late than never. And this is really late. That most of the remaining COVID-19 mask mandates in the province are going to lift this weekend. So people will be able to start. Here's where some of the baloney comes in. This is something that kind of gets to my nerves. So this is the quote from, with the high vaccination rates and the COVID-19 situation continuing to improve, most of the province's remaining requirements, including public transit, will expire on June 11th. Okay, but getting back to the science, and again, I'm not anti-vaccination, but we've learned from this vaccination, despite them selling it to us a year ago. Speaking of the mistrust, they were selling it to us a year ago saying this was going to stop the spread. And some of them are denying that, since we never told you that. Yes, you did. And I played a video showing all of the different health authorities and all the different politicians, all the different media members, all saying, if you get vaccinated, it's going to stop the spread. They told us that, and they were wrong. They were dead wrong. And that's what changed the whole basis of the vaccination plans. That's when I started really turning against the mandates heavily. I never supported the mandates in the first place. But if there was any basis to try and justify them, it would be because you will spread this to other people if you don't get vaccinated and you go into public situations. Well, it doesn't stop the spread, so there's no point for the bloody mandates. And when they talk about the high vaccination rates being why they don't need masks, well, what are you talking about? It doesn't make a bloody difference, the vaccination rate for the spread. So you're mixing your issues, and this is a chief medical officer saying this. This is Dr. Kieran Moore in Ontario. Again, the trust, guys. If you're going to make us trust you on issues and things in the future, you got to quit BSing us right now. It's not happening. Let's see. On to one more thing here. Let's look at our sponsor. Actually, I should talk about that one more time too. We do have our obligations, and that's Bitcoin Well. I'm going to talk briefly about them again. Sign up for these guys. Let's look at. I'm not talking about signing up. Go on there, check out their website, bitcoinwell.com. Sign into some of their seminars, their courses. They have what's called Bitcoin Academy. As I said, it's a site to really, because it's a confusing world. Digital currencies are new. I mean, a lot of it doesn't make sense. A lot of it's, that Bitcoin mining still confuses the hell out of me. I can't quite figure out how that works. But I've learned more about the digital currencies and how you can use it and things like that, and a lot of the practical applications of it. And Bitcoin Well are the ones to help teach you what those things are reliably and safely. As we said here in the Western Standard, I've mentioned it. We've got a plan where a portion of the staff who opt in, it's optional, a portion of their paycheck will go into a Bitcoin account, and the Western Standard matches that amount, to a maximum, of course. So, I mean, all these nice, easy ways to make it simple, give you kind of a little side savings, things like that. They can help you set that up in your workplace, or just set up your personal savings plan, or set you up to pay your utility bills with it. So check them out, guys. BitcoinWell.com, an Alberta company. And of course, they got services across the whole country, though. And take control of your money. What else we got in the news here? Yeah, this is something hitting it. I went on about this. I don't know if I went on the show about it, but I sure went on to everybody near me over it. Passports got backlogged. I had to get my member of parliament to intervene it was getting towards December, because I was planning to go to the States in January, and I did go down, but I was waiting for months and months for my passport renewal. I put in my stuff in like June of last year, and it was getting into December and still no sign of this thing. And I would phone their 1-800 line. I would get nothing. I would get the runaround. Looks like we might have Leslyn Lewis in the lobby there. We'll see quickly. I'll turn to that quickly if that happens. Either way, the passport delays are just destroying us. When we've got so many other tourism challenges happening and everything else, and then to have this on top of it. I mean, I know that's for Canadians who want to travel outward and elsewhere, but all the same, it's not doing us any bloody favors. Can this government get things together? So I had to actually phone the office of my member of parliament. I'll put that tip out to other people, though, because it's amazing. Even though the 1-800 number got me nothing over and over and for a long period of time, within a week of getting my member of parliament on it, or at least his assistant, they managed to get some response, and I got my passport in time, and I was off to the races. So let's see. I'm just looking in the private chat. Okay, I guess the Leslyn Lewis campaign's having technical issues trying to connect and can't get on the show. I'm not sure what else I can offer during a live broadcast. I know she had another obligation coming up later, so she was only available for 10 minutes, and that kind of ran out. So maybe we'll try to get her on a third time. I don't know. We'll see. So thanks for at least coming on. These are comments from Steve. He's working on the campaign, and he said, said he could answer some questions, but that's okay, Steve. We'll try and get it another time. So I'm afraid we won't be able to get Dr. Lewis on today to talk about that, and it's too bad. It was an interesting thing. She's staking some ground that's unique among the conservative race, and that's talking about it was in the press release, the World Economic Forum travel program. And if you look it up, she's got all her releases. They're on her website, and check it out. Get in there. Saying that Canada is the first country, along with the Netherlands, to sign on with the WEF's pilot project known to introduce the Known Traveler Digital Identity, it's called. Other partners include Air Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, ironically, Airport in Montreal, and Toronto's Pearson Airport, which, of course, these airports are not exactly shining examples of good stuff. But she at least is speaking up on it, because, of course, a lot of politicians are terrified of touching these things. They don't want to talk World Economic Forum because they get labeled as conspiracy theorists. But it's there. We know that. We know they're real. It's not a conspiracy. It's an international group that really is focused on control and how strong their control or how far they'll get towards their goals. Well, that's what's in question. So let's talk about it. And this is concerning. This is talk about sharing your information. This is talking about a digital ID given to organizations that you don't trust. Speaking of passports, I mean, it's one thing to give your information to the government of Canada. It's another thing to have them sharing it through these sorts of digital identifications across the world like that. So, I mean, I do appreciate Ms. Lewis bringing, Dr. Lewis bringing that forward as part of her campaign. Perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about it another time. But again, I'll encourage people to go have a look, check out her website. Those releases are out there, and you can see those sorts of things. We just had unfortunate lines crossed today, I'm afraid. So let's wrap things up. Tomorrow I'm going to have, and this is going to be a fun one, actually. Well, both will be fun. I don't want to knock Mr. Craden, our Ottawa columnist, David Craden. He's writes a lot of stuff for us, very prolific, lots of things. He's popular. And we'll talk about some of the stories he's written. He loves getting on there and beating up on Justin Trudeau and things such as that. And after that, I've got author Derek Smith, and he wrote about, where's that title? I don't have it handy. It was like a Dr. Seuss style book. Oh yes, it was How the Prime Minister Stole Freedom. And it's like a cartoon book, and you go page by page, and it's written poetically, it rhymes and the whole works, and it's got these graphic depictions. It never actually says Justin Trudeau in it, but this theoretical prime minister looks a heck of a lot like Justin Trudeau, and the humor is fantastic, and it's hit the #1 bestseller on Amazon in Canada. It's quite hilarious. I'm really looking forward to talking to him. He's a Calgarian author, and we're going to have him to chat about it. I mean, some of those lines, and paralleling, Dr. Seuss, like he's talking about this prime minister and the truckers and how this prime minister was suffering from a brain that was 3 sizes too small, for example, things such as that. So we will have him on the show. Derek Smith, his name is. And of course, I'll have some sort of new rant and lots of conversations and issues and news items. So thank you all for joining me today, guys. And I will see you all again tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. sharp.